Thank you for joining us today, Mr. Wayne.
Okay, I appreciate the opportunity.
So, how are you doing today?
Reasonable well.
Nice.
Comfortable.
Cool. So, I
Almost.
did a little bit of research on you prior to
Okay.
this interview, and I think one quote that really spoke out to me was I think it was an Engadget interview, and I think at the end of that, you asked them, "Oh, is my life really that interesting?" And then, and then I think you ended that with, he's talked about your experience at Apple and stuff like that,
Right.
and you said, "Oh man, I'm a footnote in somebody else's history."
I really have that belief in the back of my head that I will be a footnote in history because I happen to have known someone. Yes.
Does it bother you that a lot of these interviews are based on your small time at Apple and your relationships with Steve Jobs and
Does it bother me? No.
does it like annoy you in any way? It's kind of
No,
oh,
no, no,
another one of
no. It's
these.
just, look, I live my life step by step, event by event as it happens. And by the way, I count myself extremely fortunate to have been at a turning point in history, and that establishment of Apple was indeed a turning point in history. Although at the time, of course, nobody ever knows this.
Right.
It takes the perspective of history to do that.
Like you said, after you left Apple and Atari,
Hmm.
you concluded your career at a 16-year stint with as chief engineer at a
Well, it
company.
was part of my engineering life, but some years later, I went to work for. It was 1982. I went to work for Thor Electronics in Salinas, California. Uh, the first project I did there was really something that appealed to my sense of humor. I was asked to design and build a brand new slot machine, which I did.
The
Took
one
me.
out there, the one you have.
No,
Yeah,
no.
that's the old one.
Unfortunately, I had been 10 years out of the business when they asked me to design a machine for them. And they were getting all set to license up and get us to produce these machines. But in that 10 years, the entire industry had changed. So much so that the rules of the game in the gaming industry in Nevada had changed to such an extent that neither my employer nor I really wanted to be a part of it. When they established legalized gambling in 1931 in Nevada, why? Because what was in the state? It was sand fleas and Gila monsters. It was the middle of a depression, and Nevada had already been in a depression. So what were they going to do to get some life into the state? So they hit upon two laws. One, they reduced the residency requirement to 6 weeks. Somebody could come here and get a divorce. Okay, fine. What are you going to do for 6 weeks? Oh, well, we'll legalize gambling. Well, there was a lot of gambling going on in the country, almost all of it illegal, which meant that machines were gaffed, that you couldn't trust the roulette wheels and all the rest of it. And they wanted to make damn sure that people would understand gambling in Nevada would be absolutely straight and above board. And the Gaming Commission would be a mediator between casinos and players. And neither was to cheat the other. That was the rules of the game. But the basic rule of equipment, gaming equipment, was that the player shall not be deceived into believing he's playing against one set of odds when in fact he's playing against a different set of odds. Well, slot machines were built this way. You had three reels, 20 pictures on each reel, one chance in 8,000 of hitting the three sevens. Okay, everybody knew this, no problem. Well, the new Gaming Commission rules by the time I'd finished my machine was the microprocessor based slot machine, where I won't get into the mechanics of why they went through this, but they had an electronic reel inside rather than the reel spinning and stopping at random, and then the machine looks at the reels and say, "What are you? Is it a winner? How much do I owe you?" Instead, they had an electronic reel that did the spinning, and it came to a stop and told the reels where to stop. Well, that's okay too, except that they figured they could get much bigger rewards if they had more than 8,000 combinations. So with the virtual reel system, which is what that's called, they went to 256 stops per reel. So the player is looking at a machine with mechanical reels, thinking he's playing against 1 in 8,000 odds, and he's playing against odds in the millions. They're dealing the game in the back room and come out and say, "You lose." I mean, this, as far as I was concerned, it was the same as the gaffed machines that were cheating people throughout the 20s and 30s.
I wanted to talk to you about the patents you own. I mean, the patents
Patents, yes.
that you own. From what I understand, you've developed dozens and dozens of them. And
Well, I have about a dozen patents.
which one are you most passionate about? And because I know you've taken a few to court and a few notable companies too.
I have never instituted a legal action on my patents.
Okay.
Because, as you'll read in my book, Insolence of Office, there's a section in there on patent law. And patent law in the United States is not the same as it is in the rest of the world. In the rest of the world, if you are in England and you come up with an automotive device that's worth a fortune to a manufacturer, and it's infringed by British Leyland, you wouldn't take Leyland to court. You would go to your nearest corner-friendly neighborhood constabulary and swear out a criminal complaint for patent infringement. And the officers of British Leyland would find themselves in a criminal court answering a criminal action. That's the difference. In the United States, it is not a crime to infringe on a patent, which means, as it says on the cover of every one of my patents, I've got the right to defend myself for the next 17 years against GE, Borg Warner, Westinghouse, whoever goes into court against me. And any attorney will tell you, whoever goes into court with the most money, it's like whoever goes into a poker game with the most money, is virtually guaranteed to win. Patent law has become the property of corporate entities. The independent inventor is virtually non-existent in the United States. He has no standing in law and no way to defend his invention. In short, if you ever come up with the greatest invention in modern history, the best thing you could do is to lay down with a cold towel on your head until the feeling passes, because you'll never realize anything out of it.
So I remember when I emailed you for the interview, and you responded back with, you kind of summarized your entrepreneurial ventures, throughout your life as being either a day late and or a dollar short.
Oh yeah.
And
That's me.
Well, you don't regret leaving Apple and everything.
No.
A lot of unlucky things has happened to you, like for
Yes.
example, selling the original, I guess, agreements between.
Oh
you and
yeah,
those
the
things.
contract. That's the one thing in this whole experience I really do regret. I sold that contract for $500. That was 20 years ago. That was the same contract that sold at auction about 18 months ago for $1.3 million. That I regret. Okay.
But even on top of that, I mean, like, I think you even had some of your life savings stolen from a safe too. Right?
I lost my life savings in the Florida house. That was what obliged me to sell the house in Florida. It was an inside job. Okay, we'll leave it at that. And the person who stole it was caught, spent 6 years in prison, which did me, of course, a lot of good. Okay, but there was 145 ounces of gold, $3,000 face value in silver coin, and how much collector's coin I will never know.
I mean, do you ever kind of sit by yourself and go like, why me?
No. As a matter of fact, it kind of confused people at the time. The fellow not only broke into my safe by finding the combination and going in, because the safe is 5 feet high, 4 feet wide, 3 feet deep, weighs 2.5 tons. The walls are 4 inches thick concrete and steel. He needed the combination to get in there. And what he did was he turned it over to some pros, because he had been shoving stuff up his nose, and apparently they threatened him with concrete shoes if he didn't come up with the money. So he decided to pay him off with my money. So he told them when I was going to be out of the house, and they came in and emptied the safe, and then they smashed the lock. It took me 2 days to get the lock open, to get the safe open, and I was waiting, wondering, hoping. Well, they opened the safe, and of course it was empty. And everybody was wondering why, at that point in time, I did not go screaming up the walls. And my answer to them was very simple, and I meant it. I said, what am I supposed to do, make myself sick over it besides? I mean, the situation has happened. I'll deal with it. When something happens, you just deal with it.
Is that kind of how you dealt with, any problem that, anything that's happened to you, even in the corporate world,
Oh, yes.
working, of course?
Oh, yes. I was telling you about patent law. Okay, I had a patent in 1972 on a device that had many consequences, consequential products. One of them was the first improvement in electrical meter movements in 150 years. I don't know if you're familiar with the D'Arsonval meter movement.
Mm-hmm.
You certainly don't know it by that name, but you are familiar with electric pointer meters. Okay, that was the D'Arsonval meter. It was invented in the 1850s. And that's the same meter they build today. It's got three basic technical problems. It's called Hunt, lag, and hysteresis. Well, that patent that I had in 1972, one of its applications was a meter with no hunt, no lag, and no hysteresis. It was the first improvement in direct reading electric meters, analog meters, in 150 years. I sent, as soon as I got my patent, I had built a prototype of this meter. I wrote letters to all the major meter manufacturers, Triplet and Simpson and GE and Hoyt and Feestron and all of them. Half of the people I wrote to never even bothered to answer my letter. Most of the other people came back and said, well, you'll sign this disclaimer. We'll be happy to look at your patent. Okay, in other words, sign away your rights, and then they'll go ahead and let you know whether or not they're interested. Okay.
Wow.
I did wind up with the president of Simpson in my office.
Oh.
And thought, boy, here it is. I finally made it. All right. And I showed him the meter, demonstrated it to him. He was very impressed and listened very attentively to what I was saying. And then said, Mr. Wayne, how would you like a job? I said, well, I've got my own corporation here. What do I need a job for? Well, we were hoping that maybe you'd come to work for us in Simpson in Chicago. We'll give you laboratory facilities and everything you want. And by the way, you'll bring your patent along too, won't you? So this is the sort of thing I've been up against all my life.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about Apple. And you've answered it many times of why you left. It wasn't because of passion. You just didn't want to. You just weren't sure like how long it was going to take for this.
No, you haven't hit it yet.
I read a lot of different reasons.
All right,
actually.
there were many reasons for why I took myself out of it 12 days later. One of the reasons, it was a straightforward business decision in the sense that I had had my own corporation, as I told you, years before. And that was where I learned that I was a hell of a lot better engineer than I was a businessman. And the whole thing went belly up. And rather than use the corporate shell to protect myself against creditors and so on, which is what you normally do, that's what you build a corporate shell for, I felt that it was my enterprise. It had failed because of my inability to do the job right. I blew it. Why should everybody else pay for it? Because I blew it. So all the creditors over a span of about a year were paid off 100 cents on the dollar, and all the stock that I had sold in that corporation was bought back at the price they paid for it. And I felt very good. I could look in a mirror when I was shaving and not be embarrassed. All right. But at the same time, it was a very traumatic experience. Well, with that reality in mind, all of a sudden, I'm in this company arrangement. It's not a corporation, it's a company. And who is reachable? I mean, Jobs and Woz didn't have two nickels to rub together. I had a house, I had a car, I had a checking account. I was reachable. Well, when that contract was drawn up, Jobs went out and did exactly what he was supposed to do. He got a contract with a place called the Byte Shop to sell them a certain number of computers. And then he went out also and did exactly what he was supposed to do, and he borrowed $15,000 for the materials necessary to fill the order. Perfectly appropriate. The only problem was, as I heard, the Byte Shop had a terrible reputation for not paying their bills. If this thing blew up, how was that $15,000 going to get repaid? Did they have the money? No. Was I reachable? Yes. Among other things, when Jobs and I worked at Atari, I went to work for Atari. The company was 3.5 years old, and Atari was organized under the genius of a man by the name of Nolan Bushnell. Nolan Bushnell. Yeah. Okay. Well, Nolan, being the genius that he was, pursued exactly the same course that geniuses do when they go into business like this. Get the product out on the street. What it takes to set up a company is a nuisance. All right. You want to set up a drawing number system? Fine. Your first drawing is drawing number 1. Next drawing is drawing number 2. It doesn't work that way. Not when you had been in engineering and design and drafting for the number of decades that I had. You had to have a meaningful numbering system so that the documents that you put into the files were traceable. You could pick up one document and follow the thread of numbers to rebuild the entire paper structure for that particular product. And you do this through the structuring of your numbering system. So I had to rebuild the numbering system. Jobs knew about these documentation systems that I had put together for Atari, and he was very impressed with them. And I had every reason to believe that Jobs wanted me in Apple to set up and run their documentation systems, their documentation department. Well, there was a bit of a problem there because I was a product development engineer of my own right, even though I knew at the time that I was standing in the shadow of giants. All right, I knew these guys knew a hell of a lot more about product development than I did. I felt I was never going to get a project of my own. They would certainly never get involved in slot machines, which was my passion. And the last thing I wanted to do was to spend the next 20 years of my life in a large backroom office shuffling papers. These were some of the reasons. Aside from the fact that I was in my 40s and these kids were in their 20s. And they were whirlwinds. It was like having a tiger by the tail. And I said this many times before, and I meant it. If I had stayed with Apple, I probably would have wound up the richest man in the cemetery.
Now, if you were the same age as them, would that have changed your
Oh,
decision?
of course. Absolutely. Because my whole worldview would have been different 20 years before. I mean, as I say, I was in my 40s. So I'd had quite a bit of life's experiences and quite a bit of formulated ideas of my own as to what I saw for myself.
Was a young Steve and were they both like relatively risk takers, you would say?
Oh, absolutely.
Definitely.
I mean, just to do what I just described to you was a risk.
Right.
All right. But that was, let me put it to you this way. The entire Apple enterprise from then to the time he passed on was Steve Jobs. You may recall that when Steve Jobs was running the enterprise, it was very successful. He got into an altercation with his board of directors in which he lost, and he left the enterprise. And from there, it took a huge dip. And it wasn't going to come back again until Steve Jobs came back again. That's got to tell you something. Now, what sort of a personality did it take to do what Jobs did? Personality. Okay. If you had your choice between Steve Jobs and an ice cube, you'd nuzzle up to the ice cube for warmth. All right? He had me come in to help him work out a fairly simple dispute with Steve Wozniak because he himself was not that much of a diplomatist. And he thought that I could do it. I'm the adult in the room. Okay? And I worked it out. Wozniak was a reasonable fellow. All he'd do was lay it out for him. He could understand that Jobs' position was correct in that dispute. And that was it. So that was fine. But that wasn't Jobs. Jobs was not a diplomatist. Jobs was a sort of a fellow that played people like pieces on a chessboard. And he was very serious about what he did. And he had every reason to believe that he was absolutely right, which meant that if your view was different than his, you better have a damn good case to present.
You said he was a ruthless businessman, I think.
Oh, very. Absolutely. Totally.
Even at that young age he was.
Even at that young age. The last place you ever wanted to be was between him and any place he wanted to get to. You'd wind up with footprints on your forehead. I mean, this is the sort of a guy he was. I had one altercation with him after some years after Apple had gotten started, and something he wanted me to do. He came to see me, and he wanted me to do this, and I didn't feel that it was right. And I think I was one of the few people in the world that said no to him. I don't think he liked it.
including saying no to his offer for you to come back too.
Oh, he 3 times he offered me a position at Apple during the years that followed the founding.
And he's very adamant about it too.
Oh yeah, he's very strong about it. But I said no. This is you got your world, I got my world, and that's the way it wanted to be. But he had. I've been working for a company called LTD, I think it was. And it was a guy who had developed a chip that made it possible for a touch switch to be expanded into a touch potentiometer. And you do this on your iPhones and so on right now. You slide your finger along the screen and you get the pictures to move and so on. Well, I worked for the guy who had had the original patent on those chips that did this. And Jobs wanted me to talk the guy into selling his company to Apple. And I said, no, I wouldn't do that. And I said I would talk to the guy about licensing the technology to Apple exclusively. No other computer company would have it, but I would not encourage the guy to sell his company. I mean, that's all the guy had. That was it. That was the whole thing. I have to admit today that probably my decision in that was wrong. Not in the sense that I was wrong in my philosophical concept. I was wrong in not giving the man the choice to make for himself. And in that sense, I was wrong in that decision. He came to me at the beginning, and he was telling me about this situation that he had with Steve Wozniak. Wozniak had developed this personal computer circuit, and they wanted to found a company. But there were other things that he wanted to do, things that were more interesting. And he wanted my opinion. Should he proceed? And I said, well, that computer that you're talking about is undoubtedly going to be a very successful product. And whatever it is you want to do, you can do it a hell of a lot more easily with money in your pocket. And so I would, if I were you, I'd go ahead and do it, you know. And, well, in that sense, he took my advice along with probably 50 other people's advice and went ahead and did it. But I also told him at the same time, I said, look, one of the pitfalls you have to watch for is success. When you have made a lot of money, don't forget what you wanted the money for. He forgot. I had the distinct impression that it may have been making money at the beginning, but not very long into the enterprise. It was the enterprise itself. It was the game that drove him. The money was incidental, although he was not very open-handed when it came to money. But nonetheless, I don't think it was making money that drove him. I think it was the game itself.
So out of all the things you've done in your life, and you know, you reflect, what would be the proudest thing that you've done, that you remember the most?
That depends on what category we're talking about.
What would be the first thing that pops in your head?
The first thing that pops into my head in terms of accomplishments, of which I've had relatively few absolutely glorious successes. When I was working for Thor Electronics, and I had designed their slot machine, and then the company and I both decided that's not what we wanted to do, so they made me chief engineer. Because, among other things, they had a problem to solve. Litton Data Systems had come up with a field computer, one of these little bricks that went into military application, and it had many, many, many possible uses. So it came to me to develop the entire product, solve the problem, and come up with a brand new product and design it and make it work, even sometimes, in a few cases, machine some of the bits and pieces that went into it. And that's the product I'm proudest of. It doesn't mean anything. I mean, that product was obsolete and out of use along with its companion equipment 20 years ago, 15 years ago.
Right.
But it was still my product. I did it
right
from scratch.
And that's amazing.
Yeah.
So my last question is actually comes from Twitter. And
Okay.
and the person wants you to tell a story about Steve Jobs that you have not told before.
I had a stamp store in Tucson, Arizona, and I got a phone call from Steve Jobs, direct. Hadn't happened before. Hi, Steve. How you doing? He says, "Look, I haven't got a whole lot of time. Look, there will be airline tickets waiting for you at the airport, and my chauffeur will pick you up when you get here at in San Jose, and we'll set you up at no, it was San Francisco because they set me up at the Mark Hopkins." I said, well, "What's this all about?" He says, "Well, we're doing a presentation. I thought it'd be nice if you joined us." Okay, fine. And so I'm wondering what the heck this is all about. What's going on here? Because Steve, this is out of character for Steve Jobs. But anyway, okay, so I get on the plane, pick up at the airport, they set me up in the hotel. The next morning, his people come in and pick me up and take me down to the auditorium where they're doing a presentation on the G3, I think it was, or something like that. Their new, they were presenting, among other things, their new Apple computer, the one that was a transparent shell with the blue lights inside.
I'm iMac.
Okay, iMac, right. Anyway, he did his spiel on stage, and afterwards he comes, gets me, and we go into the back, and there's a buffet and coffee and sandwiches or whatever. And then we took the tour of the convention, and we jump in the car and we go off to the Apple facility, where Steve Wozniak joins us, and the cafeteria had lunch, and we're sitting around this table out on the patio, and carrying on this conversation about absolutely nothing, small talk. And then it's, that's it, have a good trip back, and we'll see you. And I'm thinking to myself, what the heck was this all about? And I never was able in my life to find out what the heck it was all about. It was, it was very anticlimactic at the end, because I'm on the plane going home. I'm thinking, it must have been something he had in mind. What did he do this for? I didn't understand.
And you don't know until
I still do not know to this day what that was all about.
That's funny. Wow. Well, thank you so much for taking the time today. I appreciate it.
Well, it's been a pleasure, I assure you.
Thank you.